Welcome. I'm Richard Seabass, the Dean of Engineering, University of Colorado at Boulder. I'm especially pleased to welcome you to this first in a series of lectures on technology and responsibility. I happen to have the personal belief that engineers carry a heavier burden of responsibility because of the technology that they develop. When a vice president, who just happened to be a civil engineer, has to resign because as a former governor he was taking bribes, the consequences are merely financial and political. But when engineers who have become managers at a major agency ask engineers who have become managers in industry to take off their engineering hat and overrule 14 engineers who have said you should not launch the Space Shuttle Challenger, the consequences, of course, are much more severe. When engineers neglect what they know about safety, neglect what they know about chemical processes, try and cut corners for profit, and you have a disaster like Bhopal, with 3,000 people killed, 10,000 people disabled, and 100,000 people injured. You surely must bear the weight of that responsibility. So we're very pleased to launch this series this year of lectures in technology and responsibility. It is my belief that the more one considers his or her opinion, the less likely it is for mistakes to be made. And that is the subject of today's lecture. I'm very pleased now to introduce Professor Athanasios Moulakis, the director of the Herbst Program for Humanities for Engineers, who will be the host for this program, and he will introduce his co-panelists today. Thanasi?
Thank you. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Under this roof, special events usually have titles like the roles of acid-based interactions in X-ray photoelectron spectroscopy, or computer-aided analysis of internal radiation, conduction, and convection in crystal growth processes. This is the sort of thing we usually do, as well we might, and we do it very well. We have an exceptional, I heard marvelous things yesterday about the things we do, firsthand from the people who are in charge of it. For instance, about these computers are going to be running on light, about this enormous Earth whirligig, for example, which allows simulations that permit all kinds of marvelous things to happen. The biggest and most important one, except for one rumored to be in what used to be the Soviet Union. We do all that very well, but we also know that engineers are people. In fact, they are human and all too human like all of us. I do not want to enter into the vexed question whether all thinking is ultimately algorithmic. I don't want to discuss the question whether in the end all of our thinking can be at least imitated by machine. What is sufficient for our purposes is to know that for practical purposes and for people will have to make the kinds of decisions and the kind of thinking that requires something other and something less than precision. We have to learn to, or rather teach students to entertain ambiguity. We have to allow them to develop a responsible manner to deal with questions that do not allow for simple answers. And all of this requires an opening which can only happen by exposure to the wealth of the civilizational goods of our tradition. This we have tried to provide a truly university education, not merely a professional training for engineering students. That is to say, all we can hope to provide, but which we do, I think, with great care, is provide a foundation, a nursery, as it were, for the long process of lifelong cultivation. The interesting thing is that this process does not merely enhance the roundedness, the good life of these young people as they grow into mature and mature people, but the very elasticity of mind that this brings with it makes them in the end, and that is as it were over and above the higher goals, as it were, it makes them better engineers. Insofar as as at the highest levels of engineering design, the elasticity of mind precisely allows an attitude, an aptitude of changing the terms of reference with which a problem is posed, and makes things like creativity possible. The way in which we have approached it through the Herbst Program of Humanities, which we have been able to start thanks to a donation of Clancy Herbst, somebody who graduated from this college in 1950 and who, in his experience in his life and in his contact with small discussion group classes, discovered that this was something that he had missed back in his student days. And thanks to that, we have created small discussion groups, a program which discusses first-rate things in small discussion groups, creating a community of learners. And we think, certainly the students think, if I may brag, that we're doing a very fine job. I am also hoping that this is not enough. That is to say that our program will be a stimulus, not merely in itself a valuable thing, but a leaven, providing for the possibility of expanding, of taking more care of these non-technical aspects of a proper education. And therefore, I am hoping, and we have a number of proposals that we can help create an atmosphere and institutional underpinnings for a proper university education for engineering students. One of the various initiatives is this series which appeals to a broader public, which appeals to themes that cannot be so easily discussed in the didactic smallness of small groups, but which has the possibility of attracting people from different walks of life with different experience, able to speak to us as people who had to face those difficult decisions, those decisions with sometimes incompatible ends, with ends that cannot necessarily be combined. And we have been able to persuade a number of excellent people to join us. I am particularly pleased and proud that the first one was Harvey Mansfield. Harvey Mansfield is professor of government at Harvard. He has written extensively on the history of ideas, on Machiavelli. He has written on the American Constitution. He has just brought out a wonderful book on the American Constitutional. And he is a man, let me say, who has always, in his examination of political thought, put together, or sought to put together, the busy goings-on of people with the sources of meaningful human existence. It is not very usual to do that. Most political scientists, I can call them that, or many at any rate, just observe the busy goings-on without seeking to refer them to a meaningful core. It seems to me particularly appropriate that somebody who has done just that would address the first issue that we wanted to raise, namely that of a professional education and the examined life. Let me say once more that I am delighted to have with us a man who has kept his head when all around him have lost theirs on several notable occasions, and I am delighted to introduce a marvelous scholar and a friend, Professor Mansfield.
Thank you, Professor Moulakis, ladies and gentlemen. The title of my remarks today is Defining Terms. We have a title of a panel, Professional Education and Examined Liberty, and that's the first item in a series which is Technology and Responsibility. So those are four things: professional education, examined life, technology, responsibility, and I want to define them by telling a kind of story. I begin from the essay on two cultures that was written about a generation ago in the late 50s by C.P. Snow. He was, the two cultures are the culture of science and the culture of humanities, and Snow was a scientist who became a novelist, and he thought he knew something about both of them, and he tried to explain what they were and what their differences were and what their characteristic conflict is. More recently, a colleague of mine at Harvard, a biologist, Edward O. Wilson, whose name you've probably heard, author of this wonderful book on ants, asked a question: how can humanists ignore what science says about human nature? Humanists are always talking about human nature. Well, where do they learn about human nature? Well, from Aristotle, Hobbes, Descartes, Rousseau, books like that written centuries ago. They should read more recent, that is, modern, current science on human nature, and if they did, for example, they would find that there are certain natural limits to their utopian schemes. But there's also another colleague of mine, Stephen Jay Gould, equally famous. He believes just the opposite. He believes in the importance of nurture over nature. One cannot describe nature in such a way as that it sets bounds to our desires. There don't seem to be any limits. The person who listens to both of these comes away with a suspicion that their opposition is based on politics or a political point of view and not on science. And this suspicion has been worked out in a book you've probably heard of by Thomas Kuhn called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Kuhn argues that science proceeds almost politically. There is a ruling theory or paradigm, he says, which is replaced by another ruling theory or paradigm. And this replacement doesn't occur because people look at things impartially. Scientists look at things impartially, and the evidence gradually builds up against one theory, and then finally that theory topples over, so to speak, and another grows up in its place. No, theories are backed and promoted, almost in a political way, by their sponsors. And science proceeds then by a series of almost political revolutions. Now, this book of Kuhn's is in turn based on some more fundamental thoughts by a German philosopher in the 19th century, Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche made a distinction between life and science. Human life is one thing, science is another. The scientist is a human being. As a scientist, he cannot explain why one should study science. That doesn't come under his science. He cannot justify himself as a scientist with science. Anyone who wants to justify science has to go out of science. And in fact, Nietzsche continues, science deadens man. It deadens, mortifies every human activity. What does scientific objectivity mean? And isn't that the fundamental principle of a scientist? It means denying yourself, refusing to believe what you would like to believe, and instead looking at the facts objectively. And this objectively always means self-denial. And so Nietzsche says, scientific rigor is really rigor mortis. The life of the scientist, and in this he includes the life of a scholar, is that of an ascetic, a person who denies life. Life is a whole. Science is carved up into parts, such as those titles that Professor Moulakis read you. Scientists specialize. In one of Nietzsche's book, he has a character stand up and say, I am a human being because I'm the world's greatest expert on the brain of a leech. But how can you be a human being if that's all you know? That's not a man. And of course, this specialization that he's speaking against is the basis of our present-day professionalization, and also the basis of the distinction between the two cultures, that of science and that of the humanities. And of course, it implies, indeed it says right out, that science is something inhumane. Hence the superiority of the humanist. He knows, or thinks he knows, the answer to the question, why science? Why be a scientist? And therefore what he knows is more fundamental than science. And that is why the humanist typically ignores, I think, the results of modern science and does it with a good conscience, despite the strictures of Edward O. Wilson. Today, when people speak of the examined life, what they mean is the life of the humanist. And that means the human interest in scientific discoveries. How does this affect human beings? And so, as I say, humanists, knowing this, can ignore science with a good conscience. Look at the problem of technology versus the environment. The environment, the cause of the environment is put forward by humanists, people who take up the human interest. They say that scientific specialists forget the effect of science on the planet. The planet is the home of human beings. So the defenders of the planet are humanists. You can see a kind of contradiction here in environmentalism. Environmentalism is in the first place an accusation against man, against what we are doing with our planet. And yet the environmentalists want to protect the earth, which is the home of man. If man is so bad, why save his home? Environmentalist resembles science, according to Nietzsche. It both denies man by accusing him of fouling the planet and affirms man by claiming to defend the home of man, our earth. But the phrase examined life has an older history, as you know. It goes back to Socrates and to a statement in Plato's Apology of Socrates, where Socrates says, "The unexamined life is not worth living." Not worth living. That sounds like an exaggeration, and perhaps it is. In this dialogue of Plato's, and indeed of all of Plato's, there isn't really anything on what we would call a profession. But in the Apology, Socrates goes around, he's trying to find out why people are saying he's as wise as he is. And he goes around asking 3 different groups to find out what they know. Poets, politicians, and artisans. Well, the first 2, the poets and the politicians, know nothing worth knowing whatsoever. The artisans, however, know something. They know what they do. The shoemaker really knows how to make shoes. It's on the bigger questions, how shoes fit into human life as a whole, that they begin to fall down. What are the arts, according to Plato, or according to the Greeks? An art is something, for them, is something that has limited bounds, like the shoemaker. He makes a shoe, and he knows what pertains to making a shoe and what doesn't. So there's a distinction between being a shoemaker and not. It's a rational thing. If you ask him why he's doing something that he's doing, he can give you a reason. And it's perfect. In principle, you could make a perfect shoe, one that would perfectly fit any human being. You don't deal with the whole human being in the arts. But what does, according to Plato, according to the Greeks? Virtue. But what is virtue? Virtue is a kind of perfection of the soul. Virtue is composed of different virtues. Aristotle counted up 11 of them. The virtuous person is virtuous for the sake of virtue, but also for his own sake. Also for his own sake. Not so much to help others, though some virtues involve helping other people, but mainly for the purpose of perfecting himself. The virtues have perhaps a certain ranking. Some of them are higher than others. The highest virtue might be the virtue which combines all the other virtues. Something like magnanimity, according to Aristotle, or justice. So virtue is the fulfillment, the perfection of all human capacities, and especially the highest. Now this outlook has a certain political consequence. Being a political scientist, I'm always interested in the political consequence. And you can see immediately that the political consequence of this in general is aristocracy. or a politics with a certain aristocratic caste. The most virtuous, the best, should be on top. So the regime of virtue is a regime of gentlemen. That might be a translation of the Greek, which more literally would mean noble and good. These gentlemen are amateurs. They don't have arts, because arts have to do with the satisfaction of needs. The artisan, like the shoemaker, is someone who's working for other people, not for himself. But the gentleman is mainly concerned with himself, with being perfect. Later professions of a certain kind have this amateur status, the so-called learned professions, religion, medicine, and law. But in the 17th century, something new came, and that was modern science. And modern science produced a great revolution in thought and society. A revolution in thought, which could be quickly defined like this: that there's no great difference between theory and practice, as Aristotle thought there was. Knowing and doing, or rather knowing and making, are pretty much the same thing. Francis Bacon said, to know is to make. When you know what a human being is, according to modern science, you can make one, or virtually make one. And therefore you can see immediately that modern science implies something like technology already. Technology is different from the arts understood in the old-fashioned Greek way. Technology revolutionizes the arts, whereas the arts had limited bounds. Technology takes those limits away. Shoes become something else, footwear. You reconceptualize the problem of clothing a human being. Synthetics, plastics, new products. A quill becomes a pen becomes a typewriter becomes a word processor. And therefore, in a way, technology is irrational because it has no clear end to it. It implies a kind of unending process or progress in which things get better and better, but there's never any point when we can say, that's perfect. That's enough. This has an effect on the professions. And therefore, and this is part of what I mean by the effect on society. The learned professions that I spoke of are perhaps those that have some basis in philosophy, in higher knowledge, as opposed to the shoemaker. He has knowledge, he knows something, but you wouldn't call him learned. Now, however, there are new technological professions, and of course, above all, the profession of engineer. Somehow, too, the pre-technological professions remain. They're still shoemakers, but they've become shoe repairers. In the old days, they would have made your shoe entirely. They're still around, however. But they're in the technical professions, one finds a distinction between a professional life and one's ordinary life. The professional life in which you have this, or say an engineer has this fantastic knowledge that the ordinary person doesn't have. But then outside that, he behaves, well, not exactly as an ordinary person, but often very sensibly. And it's typical of the technical professional to make a distinction between his professional life and his ordinary life. Those are, so to speak, two separate worlds. There is, however, a danger here. And those are in what I would call the technologized professions. And those are the people who carry, the professionals, who carry technology into ordinary life and fail to make a distinction. I see that in the social scientists, in the social sciences, with economists. I'm going to blame economists. The kind of person who thinks free market principles applies in every department of human life. Those people have a narrowness which looks like broadness, but it isn't. It isn't breadth, it's just narrowness generalized. This kind of technologization, as you can call it, is bad for citizens. A citizen has to consider a question as a whole and from all its aspects. Now, the political consequence of technology is, I think, in general, democratic, as opposed to the aristocracy of the ancient arts and the ancient concern with virtue. And that's because technology is concerned with the satisfaction of human needs. Technology doesn't make you virtuous. It provides the conditions of virtue. You don't have to worry so much about disease because you have a flush toilet. Things like that. You live much longer. But there's no guarantee that living longer you'll be more virtuous. And worse than that, there's not even any guide as to what you should do with this longer life that you're going to have. And no requirements, no demands laid on you. Technology with an emphasis on needs is not easily compatible with virtue. That's another danger, I think, that arises from technology. And yet there is a virtue that we know, a democratic virtue. And that virtue is responsibility. What's responsibility? It's not like virtue because, as I said, virtue is concerned with perfecting yourself, whereas responsibility usually or always means responsibility for others. Responsibility is not the same thing as a duty, because duty usually implies a higher authority. It's your duty to God or to some higher principle, to the Constitution, say. Whereas responsibility is always, I think, to other human beings. There's something horizontal about responsibility. And there are two meanings to responsibility: responsible for, say, doing something well, and responsible to those whom you're doing it for. Curiously enough, responsibility as a noun is not that old a word. And the first use of it seems to be in politics. You can find it in the Federalist Papers in number 63 and 70, where the authors of the Federalist, Hamilton and Madison and John Jay, argue that one great virtue of the new American Constitution is that it produces responsibility. And what do they mean by that? Well, it's not the same thing as responsiveness, just doing what the people immediately want you to do. But rather, it's doing what the people would want you to do if they could do it, or if they knew how to do it. It's doing something on their behalf that they can't quite do for themselves. Well, beginning with this political usage, the word responsibility then soon becomes extended to professions. And we have the term professional responsibility. What does that mean? Something like taking charge of a situation in which you have a certain expertise. So being responsible is not the same thing as acting in your interest. Being responsible implies that it isn't enough if everybody acts on his interest, as if there were a system of interests, say, in which each of us has an incentive to do something and the result is somehow good. And therefore I think this is why I made that remark against the free market as something which answers all our problems. Because if there were a perfect free market in every human activity, nobody would ever have to take responsibility. It would always be in someone's interest to do the right thing. Responsibility is for a limited task, and it's for other human beings. But a responsible person often makes a claim for the necessary power to do that limited task. And in principle, this claim can be for unlimited power. This especially happens in politics. You elect me to do the job, now give me the power, give me the tools to do it. Here there is another danger, the danger of expansive responsibility. An expansive responsibility for everything. in which people attempt to be responsible for things they can't really be responsible for, while overlooking things which are close at hand. The kind of person who neglects his family out of his love for humanity as a whole. The main danger here is perhaps taking away responsibility from other people. This leads to, or can lead to, a certain paternalism. You take responsibility for me, but when you do that, you take away responsibility from me. Expansive responsibility in politics becomes the demand for charisma, the demand that our political leaders should excite us, entertain us, that our political leaders should have a vision. George Bush speaks slightingly of the vision thing. You remember, in the 1988 election, in which he was supposed to be deficient. I have a certain sympathy for him there. I'm not so impressed with the vision thing either. I think there's a great deal to be said for minding the store, taking responsibility for what you can do. Professional responsibility, too, has this distinction of two meanings of responsible. Responsibility for the task. A professional is responsible for doing a certain task, but also a responsibility to the client. And these two are often in conflict. An architect. Should an architect make a beautiful building, as his professional desire asks of him, or should he make a building that the client wants? And it seems that a professional really has a responsibility to do something more than merely respond to the client's wishes. Let's now come back to the connection between professional education and the examined life. The examined life today is understood as liberal education. So what is the relation between professional education and liberal education? Well, let me ask next, what is liberal education? Two things, I think. A kind of acculturation. And second, a challenging. Acculturation, making you into a cultured person. Teaching you or giving you an experience in what a cultured or civilized person knows. A civilized person knows Shakespeare or has had some experience with a Shakespearean play, has read Dante. Things like this make you a cultured person, and they broaden your professional education. But perhaps that isn't enough, because that is still liberal education, not understood as for its own sake. It's valuable, but it isn't the real thing, because it's understood as a kind of adjunct to, or broadening of professional education. So the second meaning of liberal education is a challenging. In this meaning, liberal education is something good for its own sake. Are these things which we believe really true? Nietzsche, as I said, argued that science is against life. That means he thought that life, human life, was a good thing. But Socrates, in Plato's Apology, questions that. He says, "Prove to me that life is better than death." All of us, ordinary, non-philosophical human beings, presuppose that it's a good thing to be alive. But we don't really know, do we, that life is better than death? This is something that we typically claim to know and don't know. Socrates, you know, was condemned to death as a consequence of this apology. He made a rather imprudent apology, really more of accusation against the Democratic Assembly of Athens. Socrates was condemned to death by a democracy. How could a democracy do such a thing? Is democracy really the best form of government if it could do such a thing to the best person living in it? That makes us think. Well, there's also a false kind of challenging today, and that's called multiculturalism. Multiculturalism says that each group in the population should be represented in the university curriculum, perhaps even in proportion. This means giving representation to each group's culture. That means giving representation to what that group already knows, the very opposite of challenging. Liberal education today is often understood as a kind of world history, a museum culture in which we appreciate everything equally. We have so much taste that we've lost any sense of discrimination. Nietzsche said, "Modern man is a walking encyclopedia." When we use that phrase, it's usually a compliment. It means someone who knows an awful lot. But he didn't use it as a compliment. It means someone who all he knows is dead things belonging to old cultures, and he cannot discriminate, just as a person who reads the encyclopedia from cover to cover cannot discriminate what is worth knowing from what isn't. Multiculturalism aims at making people comfortable. Liberal education aims at making them uncomfortable. The challenge for the teacher today, the professional responsibility for the teacher today, is to make students of all races, sects, and religions equally uncomfortable. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mansfield. I see Clancy Herbst in the audience, and I know that he has, how shall I say, a delight in poetry. I know that he even serenades the regions of this great seat of learning in rhyme. So I will take my cue from that and start with a poem which was written in 1833. Now first we stand and understand, and sunder falls from true, and handle boldly with a hand, and see, and shape, and do. Dash back that ocean with a pier, strow yonder mountain flat, a railway there, a tunnel here, mix me this zone with that. Now those must have been the days. Yeah. Yes, one could still tell false from true by handling things. And with the knowledge literally in hand, one could change the face of the earth to serve man's desire. Away with all the old cobwebs, you know, the trappings of the past. Away with what, I don't know, pretty queens dressed in doilies who tell the people if they can't find bread, let them eat cake. You know, away with all of this. Yes, away with shadows, render all plain palpable and bold. Then give the crude material that we may carve and mold. All other times were but the shade, the preface unto this. Now knowledge comes, a mortal maid, whom we may clasp and kiss. The past has no meaning, as you see, except as a preparation for our glorious present and our even more glorious future. Who needs to philosophize? That is to say, who needs to yearn or seek for wisdom? Or who needs to relate one's imperfect self to some immortal source of meaning when one can possess, or as the good book might say, know knowledge, and a knowledge that is made of the same clay as oneself? Why try to measure one's temporal existence against eternity when one is certain of an endless progress? Far as the future vaults her skies, from this my vantage ground, to those still working energies I spy no term nor bound. As we surpass our father's skill, our sons will shame our own. 1,000 things are hidden still, and not 100 known. Each generation higher and higher, at every twist of the Tower of Babel. What causes there then for introspection, for knowing oneself? That is, for knowing one's limits, when there are no limits, when one's duty is identical with the execution of some appointed task. in the professional expertise, when one's life is a career, when one's very identity is nothing but one's work. Indeed. Meanwhile, my brothers, work and wield the forces of today and plow the present like a field. Don't contemplate it, mind you. Don't look at it, yeah? And plow the present like a field and garner all you may. By the way, this is Lord Tennyson. We are perhaps a lot less certain about those things nowadays. Certainly about whether stowing a mountain flat is all to the good. But I will leave the environmental considerations to a side. I'm much more interested in something that I would call the inner development of this kind of technological impetus. And I think it is fair to call it a movement to abstraction, a movement towards abstraction. And we have, first of all, I think, fewer and fewer occasions to handle boldly with the hand. It really has become the case that the way we shape and do is more and more to do not with handling things, but with manipulating meanings. And this is something which I experience even in conversations in this house. Electrical engineers tell me that now they have to teach, as they say, from the top down, because they cannot find the guy who would unscrew the back of a radio when he was 12 and fiddle around and have some kind of, get the hang of it, which would then be refined into an understanding by an academic training. No, he has instead to be told, as it were, from above what these utterly indescribable things really are all about. The information that is involved has become external to the man. What do we learn? We learn where to access it. That is to say, it's not in me, it hasn't formed me. It isn't like the turn of a hand that a good shoemaker, for instance, would have. It isn't like the palate that one develops for wine. It isn't like the ear that one develops for music. It is knowing which button to push so that the right database will come on. The problem is not the absence of information or its rapidity, which does remarkable things. In some sense, one could say that it liberates one to think other thoughts. It is also possible that it lets one rust. But there is this, as I say, this abstraction, but I think of this abstraction in a more serious sense than it leads, I think, to a collapse of communication, despite the speed, perhaps because of the speed. A collapse of communication that goes beyond what our friends now would have called the two cultures. I think that it is the case that the triumphant march of technology has left us, strictly speaking, speechless. The formally coherent, logical space that technology demands, requires, and develops, which along with experimental proof establishes its validity. What this sphere of logical coherence does is reject the ambiguities of natural language. What you have is abstract mathematical notations, which it requires and develops. And these mathematical notations are increasingly divorced from everyday experience. These notations, these vocabularies, acquire a life of their own, for which there is no verbal equivalent. You cannot put it into words. In some sense, this is perhaps true, if you wish, even of Euclid, if you really think about it. But at least there we have some kind of way of picturing it, not perhaps of saying it, but of picturing it. But since the powerful symbolic languages were developed by people like Descartes and Leibniz and so on and so forth, there's a world apart has been created. A world which is, of course, accessible to those who are conversant with its particular notation, but is incommunicable in real language. It is literally unspeakable. Now, the thing is that the curious thing about that is that the more powerful, the ironical thing about this, that the more powerful the intervention of man into nature becomes, the more abstract and further removed it becomes from normal sense experience. And at the same time, the more logically unified natural science aims to be, the more splintered its notational languages, the notational languages of its practitioners. It is not just the split between the two cultures that Snow was talking about, but the splintering within science itself. The split between, shall we say, the layman and the scientist is bad enough. It is the kind of split that Robert Oppenheimer, for instance, thought was utterly insuperable. He thought that it was impossible to explain the concepts of modern mathematics or physics to the man in the street without distorting them, and therefore doing worse than leaving him alone. The misunderstandings combined with the illusion of understanding would do more harm. What is needed, he says, is a harsh modesty, an affirmation that common men cannot, in fact, understand most things, and that the realities of which even a highly trained intellect has cognizance are few and far between. In some respects, of course, Oppenheimer had a better understanding, I think, of this than Snow, who thought that if you knew the second law of thermodynamics, it was the equivalent of having read your Shakespeare. Others, of course, are more optimistic, and perhaps we ought to be, because after all, we have to deal with this. There was a recent report entitled The Liberal Arts and Science, An Agenda for Action, produced by the American Association for the Advancement of Science. I underscore that it's for the advancement of science, which says, traditional courses often leave the students with incomplete or incorrect knowledge of scientific principles, underdeveloped intellectual skills, and little awareness of the influence of science on their lives. What they propose as a remedy amounts, in effect, to what I would call a return to the word, to speech. Treat education, they say, in natural science as a liberal art, integrated into the general education curriculum. Subject matter must be broadened to encompass aspects of the history, philosophy, sociology, and economics of science and technology. Now, who would have thought that mathematics, that noble edifice of unambiguous clarity and coherence, will be transformed, at least for the great mass of undergraduates, into a Tower of Babel? We witness the Association for the Advancement of Science pleading for verbal communication. Understanding the principles of science must pass, it says, not by entering directly into the uncontaminated sphere of mathematical form or the unimpeded observation of pristine nature, but first by way of a familiarity with the contingent, changeable, messy circumstances of human society, of economics, history, politics, and the rest of it. It would seem that unimpeded observation of a candid material world, as it used to be, heightened by abstraction and leading to ingenious applications, a manner of thinking to which we owe the spectacular success of technical achievement, is in its purity simply too good to be true. It must, it would seem, look back to its human, historical, social conditions of possibility, and can only reveal itself in ordinary language, with all the imperfections and all the ambiguities that entails. Whether that can be done in the form of integrating all these things into science, I really don't know. And I don't know what broadening the curriculum can possibly mean, as opposed to rethinking it and restructuring it. Because, I mean, if we have to do, this going to be history, philosophy, and sociology of science as well as history, philosophy, and sociology? And how seriously can any of these things be pursued if all of them need to be pursued? But the problem of communication is, I think, also manifest in public life, not just in the field of science and scientific notations. There's been, all this exaltation, a newspaper has been like that, of the importance of communications and so on in liberating the world. Now with Eastern Europe, all the fax machines that have helped frustrate the Russian coup and all of that. Now, yes, there is, of course, a lot of truth to that, but consider the following. In the elections of 1968, from Labor Day to Election Day, the sound bites accorded on the evening radio news, on prime time, to presidents actually saying something, people actually hearing them say something, were on an average 42.3 seconds in 1968, 42.3 seconds. By 1988, this had been reduced to 9.8 seconds. At the same time, the so-called visuals had augmented by 300%. Articulate, differentiated speech is in retreat everywhere. to the point that what you need is, of course, the small bite to catch. Hubert Humphrey was campaigning with 3 words. Where's the beef? Because nothing else could come across. It would have been too long. And if you just wait a little longer, even that proves to be too long, and we have such things as the persuasive silence of the picture of Willie Horton. Now, beyond that, there is, I think, a different kind of loss, the loss of a common world of reference. A common world, or perhaps the common world of reference was not there, but we still certainly feel pressingly the need for including people who are excluded from the possibility of getting ahead in life by not sharing in this common manner of talking. It is the problem, I think, that Hirsch in his book Cultural Literacy has faced squarely. That is to say, the necessity to speak in such a way to participate in what he calls high culture, or what we call, as it were, the functional idiom of the goings-on of American society. And I think it is a very generous view that he takes, because I think it is motivated above all by a desire not to allow the devil to take the hindmost. And I think that is an entirely laudable thing. However, what even there in this, how shall I say, humane, democratic approach of Hirsch's, the approach is ultimately instrumental. The emphasis is instrumental rather than what I would call properly liberal or cultural. I quote from him, "Why is literacy so important in the modern world? Some of the reasons, like the need to fill out forms to get a good job, are so obvious that they needn't be discussed. But the chief reason is broader. The complex undertakings of modern life depend on the cooperation of many people with different specialties in different places. When communications fail, so do the undertakings. That, he tells us, is the moral of the story of the Tower of Babel. The function of natural literacy is to foster effective nationwide communications. Mature literacy alone enables the tower to be built, the business to be well managed, and the airplane to fly without crashing. Well, yes, but also so much for the Tower of Babel indicating something about the sin of pride, something about a sense of human finitude, something about the notion that a wise providence may have wanted the world peopled by several peoples of various tongues rather than by their tyrannical unifier running a monolingual tribe. And above all, one may ask, what is the Tower of Babel for? Now, nobody ever accused President Truman of being a romantic. He was, perhaps you might say, a crypto-intellectual. So he astonished a journalist one day by fishing into his pocket and coming up with a yellowed piece of paper, dog-eared, unlike this one, but a yellowed piece of paper. And he read them this: "Men, my brothers, men the workers, ever reaping something new, that which they have done but earnest of the things that they shall do. For I dipped into the future far as human eye could see, saw the vision of the world, all the wonder that would be. Saw the heavens fill with commerce, argosies of magic sails, pilots of the purple twilight dropping down with costly bales." I'm speaking in a place that has an absolutely excellent aerospace program. "Heard the heavens fill with shouting, and there rained a ghastly dew from the nation's airy navies grappling in the central blue. Far along the worldwide whisper of the soft south wind, of the south wind rushing warm, with the standards of the peoples plunging through the thunderstorm, till the war drum throbbed no longer, and the battle flags were furled in the Parliament of Man, Federation of the World." 7 days later, he dropped the bomb on Hiroshima and proceeded to San Francisco to found the Federation of the World, which, as we know, has prevented all further conflict and will do so with great efficiency for our posterity forever and ever. Now, I really do think that the time has come to turn inward and to strive to know ourselves, that is to say, to know our limitations. Thank you.
by reading some of these books I mentioned. I think I gave authors and titles, or at least some authors and some titles. We depend upon the greatest minds that we've had in our Western philosophical tradition to leave monuments for us to look at and ponder and wonder over. And these are partly poetical, like Shakespeare and Dante, and partly more strictly philosophical, like Nietzsche and Socrates. Those are the mountain peaks, if I can use a Colorado metaphor. There are many low-lying hills, books written by professors like us, like C.P. Snow, and you can use them to introduce yourself to the higher peaks, because those low-lying hills are often closer and more familiar, more comfortable, but they often leave lingering questions that might invite further inquiry. But there are, by common agreement, I'm not going to try to list them in the manner of a canon, certain works, and I'm perfectly open as to what they may be, which make us think more than any other books that have been written.
I think that the name of Snow is pertinent to this discussion because it suggests that the two fields he's talking about are, in the most important sense, equivalent, that you really are dealing with one batch of information as opposed to a different batch of information. Whereas in fact what is involved is that I doubt that proper science is done as information, but it certainly is true that self-examination does not involve the accumulation of a pile of information. I feel that the strongest impetus in going back is in confronting important manifestations of self-examination that have been left behind in a manner that forms one rather than informs one. And it is really a matter of opening oneself to that. And I think it is very different also from going to sources, and we have no other sources than what other people have done to help us on our way. But it is not like we are looking for phrases to pick up, to agree or disagree with. It is not like we're picking up an apple and bring it to our mouth and say that it is bitter or sweet. It really is a conversation, and a conversation means that we engage that author. And that is why the whole discussion of the canon, to speak of that, seems to me beside the point, because it suggests that it is that you read things as though they were prescriptive rather than intellectual adventures that they invite you to join in.
Yes, Professor Mansfield, I am not sure I understand the message you have when you contrast multiculturalism and liberal educations. It seems to me you're saying the purpose of multiculturalism is to help people feel comfortable with each other, while your liberal education is make us all feel uncomfortable about ourselves. But isn't it true that by understanding various cultures, in fact, would even stir up more questions about ourselves and therefore is consistent with liberal educations?
Well, sure, it's always good to know things, and especially strange things. But the point is to make you learn something new, to experience them as strange. When you put them into an encyclopedia or a kind of movie of different peoples across the world, all doing these odd little things which we can look at and wonder about and then tolerate. The result is a lazy relativism, say, in which you fail to make any distinctions. A true multicultural a program, one that had the shape of liberal education, would ask you, what are they doing that's better than what we do? Or what are we doing that's better than what they do? I think the question of good and bad is essential, you know, to making you uncomfortable.
Specific at the narrow definition of cultural multiculturalism then. It seems to me, obviously, learning Confucianism is certainly will help you to feel uncomfortable yourself just as much as Western culture.
If you really learn it.
Yeah.
And,
okay.
and that means take it seriously as a totally different form of life.
I agree with
from,
that.
You know, from what we have now, and not just put it into a movie like Charlie Chan.
Agreed. Agreed. Okay.
Yes, it seems to me that what must be resisted is tokenism. I think that exactly the respect for the otherness of other cultures demands a serious engagement if you're going to do it. And one of the things that one notices, I think, is that very rarely does the pose of multiculturalism go together with the demand for a serious intellectual engagement. For instance, the very people who clamor for multiculturalism generally also are for the abolition of language requirements. Because language requirements actually mean that you have to learn something. Now, it is true that one can, through a very complex apprenticeship, acquire a genuine understanding of a culture other than one's own. But this requires a very deliberate and very long and sometimes painful process of learning, which cannot be done simply by picking down a book or taking a survey course.
Yes, Confucianism was not democratic. It was a form of government run by mandarins, as we call them now, who had this a very long and careful Chinese classical education, and they ruled the country. Okay? Now, what are the advantages of that? This is how I would look at it, say, from a political science point of view. What are the advantages of that, or the disadvantages as compared to democracy? Or is it really going to make you think whether democracy is a good thing or not, or are you just going to pat yourself on the back and say, I'm a wonderful fellow for being so tolerant of the Chinese?
There's also something about the nature of knowledge, I think, that is there swept under the rug. Insofar as knowledge is really not like a light that you can turn on to any object and you can illuminate now this and now that. You can only learn in terms of things, understand things, in terms of things you have already understood. So whether you like it or not, you have to start from where you are. And you have to start from where you are, whether you're aware of where you are or not. So maybe it does make sense to find out where you are to start with.
Well, as bad as soundbites may sound, at the same time, if you look at multiculturalism, it does bring up some shock effect to many people who are not even aware of the need to probe into other cultures as well. So I think if put into that context, probably serve no more, no worse, no better, no worse purpose than soundbites.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I think if reintroducing decent geography and history into the schools instead of interpersonal relations would do a world of good.
We've been encouraged to think that being an encyclopedia is a good thing in some ways, and so that the notion of reading in some other way is a little bit unsettling and unnerving. Hence the desire to have an historical context, or to have maps and charts, or translator's introduction or preface, one of my own particular gripes. So I think that, again, there's two ways of learning. One is learning the things that would go into one's own encyclopedia, where one makes one's decisions about factual or historical or political things which are important to oneself as an individual. And then there's that other kind of learning, which I think Professor Moulakis was talking at the very end of his remarks, about one's limitations. And I think it's possible even to read the Apology in both ways, to read it as a kind of historical document, which is good and safe and risk-free, and then to read it as a document which illuminates one with respect to one's own limitations, human limitations.
Yes, I agree with that very much. There are good introductions and bad. A good one gets you interested in what's coming. A bad one tells you you don't really need to know this. I'm superior, and so are you if you listen to me.
Which I think only emphasizes the dangers of feeling that you always need outside pointers to tell you what you're supposed to think of a particular work, rather than let it speak, let its very structure sing in song. And this is something that we experienced the other day in class. We were reading from Samuel 1 and 2 in the Bible. And the question that came up again and again was, back then, didn't they think this and that? We have, of course, no other source of knowing what they thought back then but that very book. If they went to another book and consulted it, as some of them are sometimes tempted to do, the source of that, which they would bring as external information, would be none other than the thing they wanted to interpret. It happened with Aristotle the other time when we were doing the categories. Some students went to the encyclopedia to find out what these difficult things were all about, to be told what to think of them. And of course they found that they came back with terms and discovered to their great surprise that they were identical, because of course the person who had written the encyclopedia had no other source than Aristotle himself. So you find yourself, doing these silly things. And the further thing is the presumption that there is something that is more real than thought, of which thought is but a function. Whether it is the color of your skin, whether it is the price of grain on that day, or whether it is whatever it is. But certainly not the fact that whoever it was who was thinking and putting down his thought actually thought. Yes?
I think we'll all agree that the examined life is obviously a value that we highly prize, and I'll just speak for myself. I don't put as much time into it as I wish I would. I'm sure my colleagues here all assume that probably do put more time in than I do. But I think we're dealing with a whole problem in society. You mentioned the sound bites. And if we just take and put it in the form of students, the students' attention span is so short, partly being brought up with the sound bites, that the whole idea of either taking technical literature or any kind of literature and struggling with it as one has to do it seems to almost be foreign, that you feel like you're forcing it. Do you see any solution, and particularly it's a technological problem with this tube that we have on that, do you see any solution around this in society, that we have supposedly a great communication medium, which, when it's down to sound bites, and if we just look at the amount of voting in this society, where people, a lot of them will claim they don't vote because they're not informed enough, it's obviously not functioning. What do you see as a solution?
I don't have a solution to the TV problem, to the fact that the average American spends 4 hours watching TV instead of examining his life. And incidentally, let's not be too serious about the examined life. One of the things you can do by examining your life is to laugh at yourself. And so watching comedies, if they're not too dumb, is a form of self-examination that shouldn't be despised. Obviously, TV is an example of what I was talking about, the irrationality of technological progress. We never really took a social decision to have TV. If we had, we probably wouldn't have realized just how much it would dominate our lives or what direction it would take. But and now it is here and it is moving, and it seems out of our control. The modest suggestion I would have is to demand more from our children.
More what?
More studying. More homework. Let's toughen up our schools a little, raise the standards, and see if we can educate our children a little better by asking them to do more than they're presently doing. Maybe they're watching a lot of TV partly because they don't have enough assigned homework.
I would argue that you're absolutely right, because I think if you really educate our young people, they will find it very hard to watch much television today.
Except they get caught before the education comes.
I really don't need to say this in an engineering school. Engineering schools are famous for demanding more of their students than we in the humanities, social sciences do.
In fact, I've discovered a completely new meaning for poetry. In the parlance of engineering students, somebody who is not an engineering student and is inclined to play the tuba at 2 in the morning is called a poet. To come back to the notion of value, of the value of the examined life on the one hand, and shall we say the automatons or pressures of technological society on the other, I would like to say something. First of all, that I think one needs to go beyond considering the examined life of value. It seems to me instead that it is in function of an examined life that we can give an account to ourselves and others of what is of value and what is not. The value results from the examination, it seems to me, rather than is upstream from it. On the other hand, when it comes to the pressures, as it were, the automatons, they are there, and I think it is foolish to pretend that they will go away, and I think it is also wrong to wish them away. I think that you cannot uninvent technology, and the kind of machine-bashing sentimentalism that it often takes the form of, shall we say, humane sensibility, masquerades as humane sensibility, seems to me misconceived. I think that quite simply, if we did not, if for some reason absurdly technology were to disappear, 3/4 of the world's population would starve, and the rest would be at each other's throats. I think we have to see that. So it seems to me that what is at stake is not bad machine, good thought, but rather how can we guide to finalities, and with an awareness of human limitations, the apparatus that is given. It'll have to go through and with technology and not against it. We'll have to tack in the wind, not try to face it. It seems to me.
I like to compliment the individual, whoever is responsible for this program, because I think this presentation by both scholars was very impressive, and make some kind of references to a point which Dean raised. MIT, some time ago, many years ago, invited Richard Livingstone from Oxford University, well-known classicist, to give a one-semester course on ancient world to the engineers. And the course was required. The second year, I think they brought I think it was either Archibald MacLeish or somebody else who gave another course to the engineers. So in a sense, this what you presented today was an appetizer for more extensive, more systematic type of exposure of engineers to other branches of knowledge. And I think, and then the third year, it was some famous historian who provided a historical perspective to the modern engineers about more modern world or Renaissance. So that's one thing. The second thing, some time ago, I brought here Paul Dirac, the Nobel laureate. I think I brought him here for 3 months. And every day he will go for a walk for about 3 hours. And he preferred to go by himself. Even when his wife decided to join him, she couldn't talk to him. He wouldn't talk to anybody. And that was the time when he was thinking and examining. And this is the reason, this is the way he explained why he is silent. That he wants to digest things which he reflected on, or he read about. And I think what Professor Mansfield mentioned, that if we could close or shut the TV and take a good books possibly of the ancient world, or there are books which Harvey mentioned, I think that will be much more beneficial because it provides for the reflection. It added additional dimension to our professional, to our preoccupation with our profession. And I think that's what is needed. In one more thing, and then I'll stop. One day, Paul Dirac was invited to go to Japan. And he decided to take a boat from San Francisco. And several of his admirers, including Robert Oppenheimer, decided to go to say goodbye to him when he went on the board, on that boat. And Robert Oppenheimer brought, I think, 3 or 4 books to him, to give it to him. And he gave it to him, and he said, "What for?" And he said, "So you have something to read on the way from San Francisco to Japan." And he said, "But I won't have time to think." And he didn't take the books.
Well, what Professor Razak says stimulates a thought. William Faulkner, who was a writer rather than a professor, refused to teach in English departments because he knew that, and this has to do with the liberality of education, that the liberality of an education doesn't have to do with the field. It has to do with the manner in which you do it. If you read in order to write a dissertation, which is a perfectly respectable activity, this is a professional thing, but it is not what makes your heart sing. And it is an illiberal way, if I may say so, an instrumental way of approaching such a thing as literature. So he actually refused to teach in English departments. And when he did teach, and to the extent that he was sober enough to teach, he taught at the School of Engineering at the University of Virginia. Because precisely engineers having their professional interest somewhere else, they could take literature for what it is, rather than as an object of professional interest.
Well, anyway, you and I are professionals too, and we just specialize in the examined life. So we shouldn't be superior to the rest of you. We're all in the same boat.
Yes.
I'm wondering if you have visions of the future, and do they include sort of increasingly short sound bites with increasing multicultural images in increasingly high technology, or do you see the examined life as becoming more popular among young people and taking it to a great future?
I'm not sure. I would just, I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but I would rephrase the question: how can we reform our education, try to recapture control of our future, and get American education out of the doldrums? And some of the things we need to do. One thing I already suggested: more homework for the kids. And also, I think we need to look at all our universities and tighten our standards, raise them, require more, and reconsider a lot of the more recent innovations of a multicultural character, which are put there for essentially political rather than educational purposes.
Yes, well, I feel that it's not a matter of expecting automatisms. I think that there's a lot people can do, and all I can, when I look at the future, which is impossible to predict, of course, all I can say is that people of goodwill shouldn't give up. All I say is that even if it is difficult to identify what is the good, the true, and the beautiful, what I think none of us should ever admit is that there is no such thing. We may not know where to draw the line, but there is a line. And if we give that up, I think Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Let me take the opportunity to thank the President's Fund for the Humanities, which has helped us put this together. Let me thank the School of Engineering that has given its support, both moral and material. And let me also thank the Foundation that has kindly invited us all to a cocktail party upstairs, or at any rate to a round of drinks over which we can continue our conversation more loosely. And again, I thank you all for coming and attending this, which I hope will be the first of a series of stimulating occasions to come together. Thank you very much.